The beacon's call. The sky above Nerilith burned. Commander Kelfar stood on the broken observation deck of what had once been the pride of his people, watching as orbital bombardment tore through the city's eastern sector. Glass towers, architectural marvels that had stood for 15 centuries, shattered like brittle ice, their fragments raining down on streets once filled with scholars and artists. Another direct hit on the sanctuary district, reported Lieutenant Mira, her voice steady despite the tremor in her four-fingered hands. The holographic display before them flickered with interference, but the numbers were clear enough. Civilian casualties estimated at 20,000. Shields failing at 43% capacity. Kelfar didn't respond immediately. His attention remained fixed on the horizon, where pillars of smoke rose to meet the flashes of incoming fire. The beautiful violet sky of Nerilith, famous throughout the sector for its auroras, now served as a backdrop for destruction. The Council is assembling in the deep chambers, Mira continued. They've requested your presence, Commander. Of course they have, Kelfar said, his voice carrying a bitterness he rarely allowed himself. Now that the hegemony has brought their full might against us, now they wish to listen. Above, barely visible through the atmospheric distortion, the hegemony fleet maintained perfect formation. 87 ships, from nimble destroyers to the massive dreadnought indomitable judgment, positioned precisely for maximum coverage. Their efficiency was almost beautiful in its calculated perfection. The Neuralians had managed to disable 2 smaller vessels in the initial assault 3 days ago. It had cost them their orbital defense grid and most of their fleet. The price had been too high for such a small victory. Time, Lieutenant. How much do we have? Mira checked her instruments. At current bombardment rates, planetary shields will collapse within 8 hours. Complete infrastructure failure in 12. Total military defeat in. She hesitated. 14 hours, maximum. Kelfar nodded. The hegemony was not known for mercy or quick executions. They preferred to break their opponents slowly, methodically, until surrender became the only option. Then came the terms: resource extraction rights, technological appropriation, cultural integration. His people would survive, but Neuralian civilization would effectively end. Let's not keep the Council waiting. The deep chambers beneath Nerilith's central district had been carved from living stone millennia ago, long before the modern city rose above. The walls were embedded with bioluminescent organisms that pulsed gently, casting the room in a calming blue glow that contrasted sharply with the apocalypse unfolding above. 12 figures sat around a circular table, the Neuralian High Council, representatives of the planet's major regions and disciplines. Many appeared as holograms, their actual bodies too far away to travel safely through the bombardment. All showed signs of strain, darkened scales around their eyes, dulled patterns on their skin, the subtle drooping of their head crests that indicated extreme stress. First Speaker Tellerer rose as Kelfar entered. Once the most influential diplomat in the sector, she now looked diminished, her usual regal bearing undermined by exhaustion. Commander, thank you for coming. Please, share your assessment. Kelfar didn't soften the blow. We've lost. The hegemony has positioned their fleet to systematically dismantle our defenses while minimizing their own risk. They're being thorough. Surrender remains an option, said Councillor Verix, his image flickering slightly. The hegemony has accepted terms from 17 systems in the past cycle. Those populations survive. As vassals, Kelfar replied sharply. Their resources stripped, their young conscripted, their cultures dismantled piece by piece until nothing of value remains. Better vassals than extinct, Verix countered. The chamber fell silent. The argument wasn't new. It had played out in various forms since the hegemony first appeared at the edge of their system, broadcasting their ultimatum with the casual confidence of those who knew their power was absolute. First Speaker Tellerer closed her eyes briefly. We delayed as long as possible, hoping for assistance from the Coalition of Free Systems. Their response arrived an hour ago. She gestured, and a message appeared in the center of the table, projected in diplomatic shorthand. Request reviewed. Non-intervention protocol engage. Strategic assessment unfavorable. They won't help us. Counselor Eshra translated unnecessarily, her scientific mind always compelled toward precision. The coalition has calculated that supporting Neuralith against the hegemony would trigger a larger conflict they aren't prepared to win. The message hung in the air, its clinical language a death sentence delivered with perfect, absorbing material as the door, and at the center stood a simple pedestal, supporting an object unlike anything Kelfar had ever seen. It appeared at first glance to be a perfect sphere about the size of 2 fists, hovering a few centimeters above the pedestal without visible support. Its surface was a deep, uniform black that somehow conveyed the impression of tremendous depth. As they approached, Kelfar realized the sphere was not completely featureless. Infinitesimal lines traced across its surface in patterns too complex to follow, glowing with a faint blue luminescence. "The beacon," Thaneri said reverently. Telara approached cautiously. "How does it function?" "According to the records, it requires intent." Thaneri moved to stand before the pedestal. "The activation is conceptual rather than mechanical." Kelfar frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning it responds to need, to desperation, to the genuine threat of freedom's end." Thaneri looked at each of them. "We must all focus on that reality. Our current crisis, the hegemony's destructive intent, the imminent loss of everything our civilization has built." Lieutenant Mira's communicator chimed urgently. She checked it, her expression darkening. "Commander, the bombardment has intensified. Hegemony forces have begun landing at the northern perimeter. They're moving faster than projected." The ground trembled faintly beneath them, as if to emphasize her words. "We're out of time," Kelfar said. Thaneri nodded and extended his hands toward the sphere, not quite touching it. "Join me. Focus your thoughts on what we face, on what we stand to lose." It felt foolish, a desperate ritual based on ancient myths. Yet Kelfar found himself complying, standing beside the old historian, his attention fixed on the enigmatic object. Telara joined them, then Mira, then the security officers, 6 Neuralians forming a circle around a relic from a civilization that might not even exist anymore. Kelfar thought of his homeworld, the crystal spires of Neuralith, the vast knowledge repositories, the cultural achievements of 15 centuries. He thought of the people above, terrified, dying under hegemony fire. He thought of freedom lost, of a future erased. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, so subtly he almost missed it, the patterns on the sphere began to shift. The blue lines brightened, flowing like liquid across the surface, converging and separating in hypnotic rhythm. The sphere itself seemed to darken further, if that were possible, becoming a whole in reality rather than an object. A soft hum filled the chamber, rising in pitch until it passed beyond the range of Neuralian hearing, leaving only a pressure behind the eyes. The sphere rose higher above its pedestal, rotating slowly. Then, in a motion too fast to follow, it collapsed inward upon itself with a sound like a distant thunderclap. Where it had been, a pinpoint of intense light remained, suspended in air. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Then it shot upward with impossible speed, passing through the solid rock above, as if it weren't there. Silence fell in the chamber. "What now?" Telara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thaneri turned toward the exit. "Now we return to the surface and continue our fight as best we can. And hope the myths are true," Kelfar added. "And hope they're listening," Thaneri corrected quietly. On the bridge of the hegemony dreadnought Indomitable Judgment, Supreme Commander Vexnar received the report with mild irritation. "Anomalous energy signature. Be more specific, Sensor Officer." The junior officer, a Thraxian whose chitinous exoskeleton clicked nervously as he manipulated the controls, enhanced the display. A burst of unknown radiation emanating from the central mountain range. "Supreme Commander, It penetrated our screening fields without resistance and continued outward from the system. A distress signal. Vexnar mused, his scaled brow furrowing. Analyze the transmission pattern. I want to know who they're calling for help. That's difficult to determine, Supreme Commander. The signal doesn't match any known communication protocol. Its propagation characteristics are unusual. Unusual how? It appears to be traveling faster than our instruments can track, sir. And its energy signature includes elements our systems cannot classify. Vexnar considered this briefly. Increase bombardment intensity. If they've deployed some new technology, I want it reduced to slag before it can cause complications. He turned to his second-in-command. Prepare additional landing forces. We're accelerating the timetable. Yes, Supreme Commander. Vexnar returned his attention to the tactical display, where Nerolith's defenses continued to crumble under precisely calculated fire. Whatever desperate measure the Neralians had attempted, it wouldn't save them. Nothing could. Bureaucratic detachment. There is one other option. The voice came from the far side of the table. Councillor Thanari, keeper of histories, had spoken so rarely during these emergency sessions that several council members startled at the sound. Ancient even by Neralian standards, Thanari's scales had faded to a pale blue, and his movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. The beacon, he said simply. The chamber stirred with uneasy murmurs. Ancient myths won't save us, Councillor Varric said dismissively. Not myths, Thanari insisted, his voice gathering strength. History, forgotten, perhaps. Misunderstood, certainly, but history nonetheless. Kelfar found his interest piqued despite his pragmatic nature. You're speaking of the Revenant Vault. Thanari's eyes, still sharp despite his age, fixed on the commander. You know of it. Stories, legends, a sealed chamber beneath the ancient library, predating our civilization, supposedly containing artifacts from visitors. Not visitors, Thanari corrected. Those who came before, those who stepped back. First Speaker Talara's patience visibly thinned. Councillor Thanari, with respect, we face extinction within hours. This is not the time for archaeological debates. On the contrary, Thanari replied, this is precisely the moment for which the vault was preserved. He tapped a gnarled finger against the table. 4,000 years ago, a species known as humans maintained a significant presence in this sector. Humans. Councillor Eshra frowned. The mythological warriors. Their bedtime stories to frighten children. They were real, Thanari insisted, and they were not conquerors, despite how our stories have evolved. They were arbiters, of a sort. They established balances of power, intervening when necessary to prevent exactly the kind of hegemonic dominance we now face. And then they conveniently vanished, Varric said with undisguised skepticism. They withdrew, Thanari corrected, deliberately and completely. They dismantled their outposts, recalled their ships, and departed beyond the reach of any known travel technology. But before they left, they established safeguards in systems they had protected. The chamber had grown remarkably still. Even the skeptics were listening now. The vault contains one such safeguard, a beacon, a means of calling them back in the event of catastrophic threat to freedom. Our ancestors witnessed its placement and swore to preserve it, though over millennia, the truth became legend. And you believe this beacon still functions? Kelfar asked, unable to keep the doubt from his voice. I believe it was designed to function indefinitely, Thanari replied. Human technology operated on principles our science still cannot fully comprehend. First Speaker Talara studied the ancient historian carefully. You've never mentioned this possibility before. The instructions passed down with my position were explicit. The beacon was to be activated only in the most dire circumstance, when all other options were exhausted. Thanari's gaze swept the chamber. Are we at that point, Speaker? The silence that followed was answer enough. The ancient library had suffered minimal damage, protected by its location at the base of Neuralith's central mountain range. Much of the structure was subterranean, carved into the living rock like the council chambers, but on a much grander scale. Kelfar and First Speaker Tilara followed Thaneri through forgotten corridors, deeper than either had ever ventured. Lieutenant Mira came behind them, along with 2 council security officers. The path grew narrower as they descended, the air cooler and heavy with the scent of stone and time. The keepers maintained this passage in secret, Thaneri explained, his voice echoing slightly, each generation selecting the next, preserving the knowledge without spreading it. He glanced back at Kelfar. Sometimes the military discovered hints. Twice in our history, commanders like yourself were brought into the circle of knowledge when threats emerged. And did they activate the beacon? Kelfar asked. No. The threats passed or were countered through conventional means. The threshold was never reached. Thaneri paused at an unmarked junction, considering, then turned left. Until now. After what seemed like hours of descent, they reached a circular door of unfamiliar material, neither metal nor stone, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No visible mechanism controlled it, yet Thaneri approached with confidence, placing his palm against the surface and speaking words in a language Kelfar had never heard. The door dissolved, not opening, but simply ceasing to exist. Beyond lay a perfectly circular chamber, perhaps 20 meters across. The walls were covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift subtly when viewed from different angles. The floor was inlaid with concentric rings of the same light. The hegemony's expansion was inevitable, a mathematical certainty playing out across the galaxy with the precision of a physical law. Those who accepted this truth survived, diminished but intact. Those who resisted provided object lessons in futility. He dismissed the anomalous signal from his mind and focused on the satisfying progression of the conquest. He did not notice, none of them noticed, when their long-range sensors registered a momentary disturbance at the very edge of the system. A ripple in space-time, like the surface of a calm pool disturbed by the first raindrops of a coming storm. The silent return. 3 standard days after the activation of the beacon, the hegemony's conquest of Neuralith proceeded with mechanical efficiency. The planetary shield had collapsed entirely, allowing precision strikes against key infrastructure. Neuralith's famed crystal towers, once visible from orbit, lay in ruins. Landing parties had secured the northern continent, establishing processing centers where population registration had begun. The southern hemisphere remained contested, but military analysts gave the resistance there no more than 2 days before complete collapse. On the bridge of the indomitable judgment, Supreme Commander Vexnar reviewed the morning's progress reports with satisfaction. The operation was proceeding ahead of schedule, with casualties among hegemony forces well below projections. The Neuralians had fought with more determination than expected, but determination alone had never been enough against the hegemony's overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. Supreme Commander. The voice of his sensor officer interrupted Vexinar's contemplation of the tactical display. He turned, noting with disapproval the unusual tension in the officer's posture. Report, Sensor Officer Thrix. Sir, we're detecting anomalies at the system boundary, specifically at the L5 Lagrange point. Vexinar's inner eyelids flickered with irritation. Define anomalies. Gravitational distortions, sir. Localized space-time curvature inconsistent with normal stellar dynamics. The officer's mandibles clicked nervously. The pattern suggests artificial origin. Ships dropping out of FTL? Vexnar asked, his irritation giving way to mild concern. No, sir. There's no characteristic radiation signature of FTL translation. No engine emissions of any kind. Just distortion. Vexnar moved to the sensor station, examining the readings himself. The officer was correct. Something was happening at the edge of the Neuralith system, but it matched no known phenomenon in the hegemony database. How many contacts? Difficult to determine, sir. The distortions are multiplying. Current count is 7 distinct anomalies, but the number is increasing. Show me. The main view screen shifted to a long-range visual of the L5 point. At first, Vexnar saw nothing unusual, just the blackness of space punctuated by distant stars. Then he noticed the distortion. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. Areas where the starfield seemed to warp slightly, as if viewed through flowing water. As he watched, the distortions expanded. Stars appeared to shift position, or momentarily duplicate. Space itself seemed to fold inward at multiple points. "What am I looking at, Science Officer?" Vexnar demanded. Science Officer Larhez stepped forward, her elongated fingers manipulating the sensor controls with practiced precision. "The readings suggest localized manipulation of space-time metrics, Commander. Similar to an artificial gravity well, but far more controlled and on a much larger scale." "Caused by what?" "Unknown, sir. No technology in our database can create these effects." The distortions on the screen intensified. Where there had been subtle warping, now defined shapes began to emerge, angular silhouettes of impossible darkness against the backdrop of stars. Not appearing suddenly, but somehow unfolding into reality, as if space itself was parting to reveal them. "Count now at 23 distinct objects," reported Sensor Officer Thrix. "Arrangement appears deliberate." Vexnar studied the emerging formation. The objects, ships certainly, though unlike any design he recognized, were positioning themselves in a perfect hemispheric array, facing the inner system. Their movements were precise, coordinated to the millisecond, without any detectable propulsion. "Size estimate. Variable." Science Officer Larhez replied. "The smallest appears comparable to a heavy cruiser. The largest," she hesitated, "the largest exceeds Dreadnought class by approximately 40%. Vexnar felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. The hegemony fleet orbiting Neuralith was formidable. 63 vessels including his flagship, but against an unknown force of this size, the outcome was no longer a mathematical certainty. Alert status. All vessels to battle formation Sigma 3. Recall ground forces not engaged in critical operations. The bridge erupted into controlled motion as officers relayed commands. Vexnar returned to the tactical display, watching as his fleet began shifting position, forming a defensive sphere around Neuralith. "Sir," Communications Officer Drezik called out, "we're receiving no transmissions from the unknown vessels. No identification signals, no approach requests. Nothing. Send standard identification challenge. All frequencies. Sending. No response, sir." The tactical display updated, showing the unknown vessels now fully emerged. Their formation had stabilized at 37 ships, arranged in a perfect crescent. They had made no aggressive moves, but their mere presence, silent, unannounced, perfectly positioned, was provocation enough. "Launch recon drones. I want detailed scans of those vessels." "Launching, sir." 4 automated reconnaissance drones detached from the indomitable Judgment, accelerating toward the mysterious formation. Designed for stealth, with minimal cross-section and advanced sensor-baffling technology, they represented the pinnacle of hegemony intelligence-gathering capability. They never arrived. Halfway to their target, all 4 drones simply ceased transmitting. No warning, no distress signal, just instantaneous silence. "Drones lost, sir," reported Sensor Officer Thrix. "No debris detected." Vexinar's unease deepened into something approaching alarm. Analysis. Science Officer Larhez studied her readings. The drones appeared to enter a localized field of some kind approximately 0.3 light seconds from the unknown vessels. Sensor logs show extreme gravitational shearing in the microsecond before transmission ceased. A defensive measure? Possibly, sir, or perhaps merely a side effect of whatever propulsion technology they're using. On the tactical display, the situation remained unchanged. The unknown vessels maintained their position, making no move to approach or retreat. "Sir," Communications Officer Drezek interrupted again. "We're receiving a transmission from the Neuralian Central Command. They're requesting to speak with you directly." Vexinar's inner eyelids flickered in surprise. "The Neuralians? Put them through." The main view screen shifted to show Commander Kelfar, looking haggard but strangely composed given his people's desperate situation. "Supreme Commander Vexinar," Kelfar acknowledged with formal precision. "I see you've noticed our visitors. You know who they are?" Vexinar asked, not bothering to hide his surprise. "We call them," Kelfar replied simply. "Or rather, we activated the beacon they left behind when they departed this region 4,000 years ago." A chill moved through Vexinar's blood. Ancient myths and half-forgotten legends stirred in his memory, stories told to frighten hatchlings. "You can't mean humans," Kelfar confirmed, his mouth forming what Vexinar recognized as a Neuralian expression of grim satisfaction. "They've returned." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Vexinar staring at the tactical display, where 37 unknown vessels, human vessels, hung in perfect formation at the edge of the system. Aboard the Neuralian command vessel Last Light, one of the few ships to survive the initial hegemony assault by hiding in the atmosphere, Commander Kelfar ended the transmission with a gesture. "Was that wise?" First Speaker Tilara asked from her position nearby. "Antagonizing the hegemony while we're still under their guns." "It doesn't matter now," Kelfar replied, his attention fixed on the sensor readings displaying the newly arrived fleet. "Either the beacon worked and those are indeed humans returned to help us, or it's some other intervention that the hegemony will have to address before continuing their assault. Either way, we've gained time. If those ships truly belong to humans," Councillor Thaneri said softly from his seat against the bulkhead, "then we have gained far more than time." The ancient historian had insisted on joining them aboard the Last Light after the beacon's activation, despite the risks of travel during the bombardment. Now he watched the sensor displays with the intensity of one who has waited a lifetime to witness a theory proven. "The stories say humans were unmatched in battle," Lieutenant Mira commented, her voice betraying her skepticism. "That a single human vessel could destroy an entire fleet. Stories grow in the telling," Thaneri acknowledged, "but they begin with truth. And the truth of humans was impressive enough without embellishment." The bridge fell silent as they watched the tactical display. The human vessels remained motionless, while the hegemony fleet had reconfigured into a defensive posture. "They're just waiting," Mira observed after several minutes had passed. "Observing," Thaneri corrected. "Assessing. The records indicate humans were methodical in their interventions. They never acted without understanding the full context of a situation." "How long will they wait?" Tilara asked. "That," Thaneri admitted, "the records do not say." On the display, the standoff continued, two fleets facing each other across the void, one arranged in a textbook defensive formation, the other in a pattern that followed some alien geometry, perfect and inscrutable. Until, suddenly, it changed. Without warning, without visible propulsion, three of the human vessels detached from the formation. They moved with impossible grace, covering the vast distance to Neuralith, not in hours, as physics would dictate, but in minutes. "They're accelerating too." Mira's voice faltered as she studied the readings. "That's not possible." "What do you see, Lieutenant?" Kelfar asked sharply. "They're moving at speeds our sensors can barely track, but there's no engine signature, no reaction mass, no gravitational distortion." Mira looked up, her expression haunted. "It's as if space itself is contracting around them." On the tactical display, the three human vessels slipped past the hegemony formation without resistance, moving too quickly for interception. Within moments, they had entered Neuralith's orbit, positioning themselves in perfect triangulation around the planet. "They're scanning us," Mira reported. "The entire planet, simultaneously. The energy pattern is like nothing I've ever seen. It's passing through all matter as if it were transparent." "Are they communicating?" Tilara asked. "Negative." No transmissions detected on any frequency. Kelfar studied the display, uncertainty warring with hope. What are they doing? Before anyone could speculate, the answer came. From each of the 3 human vessels, smaller craft emerged, hundreds of them, each no larger than a personal transport. They descended toward the planet's surface in perfect formation, targeting areas where hegemony ground forces had established control. "They're landing," Mira whispered. In the northern city of Calith, now a hegemony processing center, Fleet Marshal Drexvor supervised the orderly registration of Neuralian civilians. The operation was proceeding smoothly. The natives had offered little resistance after their defensive grid collapsed, accepting their new status with the resigned dignity Drexvor had come to expect from conquered species. His command post, established in what had once been a Neuralian administrative center, offered a commanding view of the surrounding plains. From here, he could monitor both the processing lines and the perimeter defenses that kept the peace. "Marshal," his aide approached with uncharacteristic haste. "Priority alert from Orbital Command. Unknown vessels have entered the system and breached our defensive cordon." Drexvor accepted the datapad, scanning the brief report with growing concern. "Deploy aerial defense batteries. All ground forces to alert status. Sir, the unknown vessels are already in orbit. Smaller craft are descending toward our position." As if to punctuate the aide's words, a shadow passed overhead. Brief but noticeable enough to draw Drexvor's gaze upward. What he saw defied explanation. A vessel of unfamiliar design hung in the air above the city, not hovering on repulsors or anti-grav fields, but simply present, as if space itself accommodated its existence without question. Its hull was angular, composed of overlapping geometric planes that seemed to shift subtly when viewed directly. No visible propulsion systems, no engine glow, no exhaust. Around it, smaller craft descended in perfect synchronization, each identical to the next, angular, obsidian, silent. "Defensive measures," Drexvor shouted, but even as the words left his mouth, he realized the futility. The vessels were already within the city perimeter, past every defense, moving with purpose toward specific targets. One of the smaller craft detached from the formation, descending directly toward the command post. Drexvor's security team raised their weapons, targeting systems locking onto the approaching object. "Hold fire until my command," Drexvor ordered, forcing calm into his voice. The craft stopped its descent approximately 10 meters above the courtyard, hovering silently. Its surface appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an unsettling void in the shape of a vessel. For long moments, nothing happened. Then, a section of the craft's underside simply opened. Not a door sliding aside or a ramp extending, but a reconfiguration of the hull itself, the black material flowing away to create an aperture. A figure descended from the opening, humanoid in basic form, but utterly alien in its details. It wore what appeared to be armor, though unlike any design Drexvor had encountered. The material was similar to the vessel's hull, light-absorbing, geometrically complex, constantly shifting in subtle ways that defied focus. The figure touched down on the courtyard stones with unnatural grace. It stood perfectly still, facing the command post where Drexvor and his staff watched in frozen uncertainty. Then it spoke, not aloud, but directly into Drexvor's mind, the words forming with perfect clarity in his native language. "This planet is now under human protection. Your presence is no longer required." Human. The word sent ice through Drexvor's blood. Legends, myths, stories to frighten hatchlings, suddenly standing before him in terrible reality. "We claim this world by right of conquest," Drexvor responded, amazed at the steadiness of his own voice. The hegemony does not recognize interference from third parties. The human figure remained motionless. When it responded, the words seemed to form not just in Drexvor's mind, but in the air itself, vibrating through molecules in a way that made his teeth ache. "We are not a third party. We are the first party. We were here before your hegemony existed. We will remain after it is forgotten. Around the courtyard, Drex 4's security team shifted nervously. Fingers tightened on triggers. Targeting systems hummed. You have 1 standard hour to withdraw all forces from this planet, the human continued. After that time, withdrawal will no longer be optional. Drex 4 felt anger rise to replace his initial shock. No power in the galaxy dictated terms to the hegemony. Not anymore. You threaten us, one being against a secured facility, against an entire invasion force. The human figure tilted its head slightly, the first movement it had made since landing. The gesture was somehow more unsettling than its previous stillness. I am not threatening. I am informing. The choice to perceive information as threat lies with you. One of the security officers, young, nervous, perhaps overeager, fired. The energy pulse struck the human figure directly in the chest and passed through it without effect, striking the ground beyond. In the instant of the weapon's discharge, everything changed. The human figure blurred, its form seeming to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Before anyone could react, it stood directly before Drex 4, close enough that he could see his own reflection in the featureless faceplate of its helmet. Your hour begins now, it said, the words resonating through Drex 4's bones. Use it wisely. Then it was gone, not retreating, not flying back to its vessel. Simply no longer present. The black craft above sealed itself and ascended, rejoining the others in their precise formation. Drex 4 found himself breathing heavily, his heart racing in a way it hadn't since his first combat deployment decades ago. Marshal, his aide prompted quietly. Your orders. Drex 4 stared at the empty space where the human had stood. Everything in his training, in his decades of service to the hegemony, told him to stand firm, to call in reinforcements, to crush this interference as the hegemony had crushed all opposition for centuries. But deeper, older instincts whispered something else entirely. Run. On the bridge of the indomitable judgment, chaos had erupted into disciplined alarm. Reports flooded in from ground forces across Neuralith, identical encounters, identical ultimatums, delivered by beings who appeared impervious to weapons and moved with impossible speed. Signal from Marshal Drex 4. Sir, Communications Officer Drezik reported. He's requesting emergency extraction for all ground forces in the northern continent. Supreme Commander Vexnar's inner eyelids flickered rapidly, a sign of extreme stress. On what grounds? Sir, his exact words were, they are not what we thought. They are worse. Before Vexnar could respond, Sensor Officer Thrix called out, Supreme Commander, the main human fleet is moving. On the tactical display, the crescent formation of human vessels had begun to advance toward the inner system, not at the impossible speeds demonstrated by the 3 ships that had reached Neuralith, but with the deliberate pace of an inevitable tide. Weapons status. Vexnar demanded. All weapons systems online and locked, sir, reported Weapons Officer Calvix. Targeting solutions prepared for all approaching vessels. Vexnar hesitated. In his 3 decades of service, he had never faced a situation where victory wasn't a mathematical certainty. The hegemony's technological superiority, combined with overwhelming numbers, had made conquest a simple equation. But the variables had changed. An unknown factor had entered the calculation, a factor out of legend, moving with technologies that defied understanding, making demands with the casual confidence of absolute power. Sir, Communications Officer Drezik interrupted his thoughts. We're receiving a transmission. From the human fleet. On screen, Vexnar ordered. The view screen remained empty, showing only the advancing fleet. But a voice filled the bridge, calm, measured, with the weight of ages behind it. Hegemony vessel indomitable judgment. This is the human vanguard ship Reclamation. Your presence in this system violates Protocol 1 Delta of the Provisional Interference Treaty established between humans and all sentient species of this galaxy 4,000 183 standard years ago. Vexnar felt his blood run cold. That treaty was myth, a story from before the hegemony's rise, a fairy tale about ancient beings who had once kept the peace before disappearing into legend. The voice continued, "You have been offered the opportunity to withdraw without consequence. This offer expires in 42 minutes. After that time, we will enforce the treaty through direct intervention. The hegemony acknowledges no treaty we did not negotiate." Vexnar responded, forcing authority into his voice. "This system falls within our sphere of influence, as established by the Galactic Concordance. The Concordance was established 1,274 years after our departure." The voice replied without emotion. "It holds no standing against prior arrangements. Your hegemony exists because we allowed the space for it to develop. That allowance has limits." The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Science Officer Laraz was the first to speak. "Sir, if that truly was a human vessel, the implications are extraordinary. Their technology, their knowledge of our history, myths and intimidation." Vexnar said sharply, but without conviction, "Every subjugated species tries to invoke saviors from the past. These may be some previously unknown race using old legends to their advantage." Even as he spoke, he didn't believe his own words. The ships advancing toward his fleet moved with too much confidence, operated with technologies too far beyond known science, to be dismissed as opportunistic pretenders. "Orders, Supreme Commander," Weapons Officer Calvix asked. Vexnar studied the tactical display. The human fleet continued its advance, steady and implacable. His own forces remained in defensive formation, weapons locked but awaiting command. 42 minutes until the ultimatum expired. 42 minutes to decide whether to make history by standing against beings out of legend, or to retreat and face the Hegemony Council's wrath. 42 minutes to determine the fate of everything he had ever served. "Maintain defensive posture," he ordered finally. "Prepare extraction vessels for our ground forces. Launch probe drones to monitor the human fleet's approach." It wasn't a decision. Not yet. But it was acknowledgement that the certainties that had guided his entire career no longer applied. For the first time in centuries, the hegemony faced something it could not simply overpower and absorb. Humanity had returned. Ghosts of the past. Grand Admiral Seltorus, Supreme Military Commander of the hegemony, stood before the curved viewport of his private chambers aboard the command station Eternal Vigilance. His scaled hands were clasped behind his back, claws retracted in the formal posture of contemplation. Before him, the holographic display showed the Neuralith system, where a situation unprecedented in his 60-year military career was unfolding. The images were delayed by light speed limitations, but that hardly mattered. The scene had remained essentially unchanged for the past 12 hours. 37 vessels of unknown design, claiming to be human, facing off against 63 ships of the hegemony's 7th battle group. A standoff that defied every protocol in hegemony military doctrine. The door chimed softly. "Enter." Cell Torres called without turning. Intelligence Director Vex glided into the chamber. A Synthi by species, she moved with the peculiar floating motion characteristic of her kind, her elongated body suspended by a personal gravitational field rather than supported by limbs. "Admiral," she acknowledged, her voice a harmonious blend of tones. "The Council has convened. They await your assessment." Cell Torres continued to study the display. "And what shall I tell them?" "Director, that Supreme Commander Vexnar, one of our most decorated officers, has been paralyzed into inaction by vessels that shouldn't exist, claiming to represent a species that vanished millennia ago." "The facts would be appreciated," Vex replied mildly, "regardless of how uncomfortable they may be." The Admiral's ridged scales rippled in irritation. "Facts? What facts do we have?" "Unknown vessels, technologies we cannot analyze, demands based on treaties that exist only in ancient myths, and the evacuation of our ground forces from Neuralith," Vex added. a full withdrawal ordered by Vexnar after direct contact with the visitors. Torres finally turned from the viewport. You're suggesting Vexnar actually believes these are humans, that he's allowing ancient legends to dictate military strategy. I'm suggesting, Vex said carefully, that Vexnar experienced something that changed his risk assessment. He has not retreated from the system, but he has pulled back from the planet. There is a distinction. The Admiral moved to his desk, examining another display that showed the positions of the two fleets. Has there been further communication from these claimed humans? None since their ultimatum expired. They have established orbital positions around Nerilith, but have taken no further action against our fleet. And Vexnar maintains defensive posture at the system's ecliptic boundary, awaiting instructions. Torres gestured toward a communications panel. The Council awaits, you said. Yes, Admiral. Full quorum, including the Sovereign Triumvirate. That was unusual. The three beings who ruled the hegemony rarely attended military briefings directly, preferring to receive information filtered through their advisors. Very well. The Admiral activated the panel, and a large holographic projection appeared in the center of the chamber. A circular table surrounded by the 27 members of the Hegemony High Council. Each counselor appeared as a life-sized representation, their diverse species united by the common insignia of the hegemony emblazoned on their formal attire. At the head of the table sat the Sovereign Triumvirate, Sol, Varu, and Neth, representatives of the three founding species of the hegemony. Their exact appearances were obscured by ceremonial robes and masks, a tradition maintained for security, and to emphasize that they spoke with one voice. Grand Admiral acknowledged the central figure, Sol, designated first voice of the Triumvirate. We are most interested in your assessment of the Nerilith situation. Torres bowed his head slightly. Sovereign, honored Council, the situation at Nerilith remains unresolved. Unknown vessels claiming human origin have established orbital control of the planet. Our forces under Supreme Commander Vexnar maintain presence at the system boundary, but have withdrawn from planetary engagement. Withdrew. One of the counselors, Morax, a militant representative from the Outer Reach, leaned forward. The 7th Battle Group withdrew from an engagement against an inferior force. With respect, Counselor, Torres replied, we cannot confirm the force is inferior. Their technology appears to be significantly advanced beyond our current capabilities. Based on what analysis? Morax pressed. Based on direct observation and preliminary reports from ground forces who encountered them, Intelligence Director Vex interjected smoothly. These visitors demonstrated capabilities that suggest a significant technological gap. Our sensor platforms were unable to penetrate their defensive systems, and their propulsion technology appears to operate on principles we do not currently understand. And their claim to be human. This from Counselor Thal, the hegemony's chief historical archivist. What evidence supports this? Vex's bioluminescent patterns shifted slightly, the Senthi equivalent of a thoughtful frown. They identified themselves as such in direct communication, and their appearance, as reported by ground forces, is consistent with historical records of human morphology. Beyond that, we have no confirmation. Humans, Thal mused, his aged features creasing. If true, this would be the first confirmed human activity in this galaxy in over 4,000 years. If true, Morax scoffed. More likely some previously unknown species using ancient legends to intimidate us. The central figure of the Triumvirate, Sol, raised a hand, silencing the budding debate. Whether they are truly human or merely claim the name is secondary to the tactical reality. Grand Admiral, what are your recommendations? Torres had been considering this question since the first reports arrived. Sovereign, I recommend a measured response. We should maintain our presence in the Nerilith system while deploying additional forces to establish a containment perimeter in neighboring systems. Simultaneously, we should attempt further communication to ascertain their true intentions. A cautious approach. Sol acknowledged neutrally. Too cautious, Morax objected. The hegemony does not yield to threats. We should deploy the 3rd and 5th battle groups immediately and crush this interference before it can spread. Several counselors murmured agreement, but one voice cut through the growing consensus. That would be a catastrophic error. The voice belonged to the 3rd member of the triumvirate, Neth, rarely the first to speak, but always listened to with care when they did. Their mask, fashioned to resemble a featureless oval of polished stone, turned slowly to regard the council. If these are indeed humans, Neth continued, direct military confrontation would be inadvisable. With respect, Sovereign, Morax began, legends about human military prowess are just that, legends, embellished over millennia, distorted by. Not legends, Counselor, Neth interrupted. History. History the hegemony has carefully obscured, but history nonetheless. A heavy silence fell over the council chamber. Zeal Torres exchanged a glance with Intelligence Director Vex, whose bioluminescence had dimmed to near darkness, a sign of extreme caution. Sovereign, Sol inquired, turning toward Neth with a subtle tilt of their masked head. The time for certain. Historical discretions has passed, Neth said. Their voice was soft, but carried unmistakable authority. If humans have truly returned, the Council must understand what that means. From within the folds of their ceremonial robes, Neth withdrew a small crystalline object, a data key of ancient design. They placed it on the table before them, and a simple gesture activated it. The holographic display shifted. The Council chamber was replaced by a star map, not of the current galaxy, but of the galaxy as it had been 4 millennia earlier. Different borders, different powers, different names. Before the hegemony, Neth explained, before the concordance, before the age of expansion, there existed a different order. Not a single empire, but a balance of powers, maintained by treaty and enforced by a species that stood apart from territorial concerns. The map highlighted hundreds of systems spread throughout the galaxy, not clustered in a continuous empire, but distributed strategically, like nodes in a vast network. Humans, Neth continued, did not conquer. They monitored. They intervened. They maintained what they called minimal sufficient stability, just enough order to prevent catastrophic conflicts, but not enough to stifle the natural development of species and civilizations. A myth of benevolent overseers, Morax scoffed, though with less conviction. No, Counselor, Neth replied. Not benevolent. Pragmatic. Humans had experienced their own cycles of empire and collapse. They had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times before achieving stable interstellar civilization. When they encountered other spacefaring species, they recognized patterns they had seen in their own history. The map shifted again, showing conflict zones, expansion patterns, extinction events. They intervened only when necessary, only when a species or alliance threatened to destabilize entire regions. Their methods were precise, surgical. They did not wage war as we understand it. They simply corrected imbalances. Grand Admiral Zeal Torres found himself transfixed by the historical data unfolding before him. This was not in any military archives he had access to, not even those restricted to his rank. How do you have this information, Sovereign? He asked carefully. Neth turned their masked face toward him. Before there was a hegemony, my species was among those who worked most closely with humans. We were intermediaries, you might say. When humans decided to withdraw from the galaxy, they left certain records in our keeping. Knowledge to be preserved, but shared only in the event of their return. Withdraw. Counselor Thal leaned forward, historical curiosity overcoming political caution. The conventional understanding is that humans became extinct or retreated after some catastrophic defeat. No, Neth said simply. They chose to leave. Their technology had reached a point where they questioned their own role in galactic development. They debated whether their interventions were truly necessary, or if they had become a crutch that prevented other species from finding their own solutions. The map shifted again, showing the gradual disappearance of human presence across the galaxy. Not a retreat under pressure, but a deliberate, phased withdrawal. Before they left, Neth continued, they established certain protocols. Beacons were placed in systems they had directly protected, to be activated only in the most dire circumstances. They made it clear that such activation would be considered a request for intervention, and that they would respond accordingly. Understanding dawned on Cell Torres with cold clarity. The Neuralians activated such a beacon. So it would appear, Neth confirmed. And these, humans, simply came back. After 4,000 years, Morax's disbelief was palpable. What species maintains such a commitment across millennia?